Welcome to the Cannabis Cultivation and Science Podcast. I'm your host, Tad Hussey of KIS Organics. This is the podcast where we discuss the cutting edge of growing from a science-based perspective and draw on top experts from around the industry to share their wisdom and knowledge. My guest this week is Brandon Hudson. Brandon is a second-generation cannabis cultivator with over 35 years of direct experience with this amazing plant. Building on fundamentals learned as a child, Brandon has applied a controlled approach to cannabis cultivation, starting with his first plants his freshman year of college in 1986. He currently works for KIS Organics, providing growers with everything from customer support to assistance with nutrients and soil tests. A well-rounded and passionate organic grower, Brandon's real passion is in soil chemistry. Most recently, Brandon was the Director of Cultivation and one of 4 founding members of a minority-owned hemp flower farm in South Carolina. He provided SOPs and oversight for all aspects of cultivation, from propagation to harvest and cure, including daily operation of a large nursery facility. In this role, Brandon also performed several federally funded hemp trials for HBCUs, as well as research projects for nutrient producers. He is a proud dad and husband who spends his free time outdoors with his veggie gardens and chickens. This week's show is a bit different as we get a lot of the same questions at KIS Organics and thought it would be fun to do a show covering a lot of the most common ones. Now on to the show. Hey, Brandon, thanks for coming on the show.
Hey, Tad. Great to be here.
Yeah, I know we talk all the time, but I want to do this show kind of talking about all the questions that you get asked on a daily basis, helping out with the phones and doing a lot of the agronomy and soil analysis. Let's just start off right off the bat talking about soil health. You get asked a lot about how to reuse the soil. Kind of take me through sort of what that process looks like with KIS.
Yeah, so it really, it's like anything. You want a little bit of background on their cultivation practice. Are they in beds? Are they in pots? That sort of thing. But after we get information about, how their grow setup is, it's all kind of similar or the same across the board. And so whether they're in pots or in large beds, which we prefer for various reasons, when they're approaching the end of a round, 3 weeks, 2 weeks, it really depends on how organized they are and how quickly they can, get things turned around. Do they have the usual suspect list of amendments that they'll most likely need on hand? That way they're not waiting to, get their test results and then order amendments. They can usually, about 2 weeks out, take a soil sample. If they're in beds, they could take a couple of samples from each bed, mix those together homogeneously, send off 2 cups to Logan Labs. If they're in pots, they can either dump all that soil, mix it together thoroughly, which is kind of my preference, but that's a lot of labor to get that back into pots. Or they can take samples from, representative pots, mix that again, send that off to Logan Labs and get their soil reports back. And so now we're armed to do the mineral nutrition side of their soil. So we'll get that soil report back and we'll send them a detailed recommendation of what amendments they need to get in. And that's pretty much it as far as the mineral side of it. It's very straightforward. We're doing it, and you and I talked about this the other day, how incredible it is that we can use metrics. We don't have to guess. And so I'm a big fan of the soil reports and getting those amendments in. And then you've got the biological side of the soil, and then you've got the physical components of the soil that you need to deal with. Physical components, we're mostly worried about compaction over time. After a couple of rounds, we've got the organic matter breaking down and we're starting to compact a little bit. And so every couple of rounds, for me, it comes down to every 4 rounds, but everybody's different. And so I'll add, maybe 6 to 8% aggregate back into my soil. I prefer pumice. I just escaped the the East Coast, the swamp, and I can say on the East Coast, it's almost impossible unless you're ordering from the West Coast to get pumice. And so a lot of folks, I recommend lava rock, even hydratin, however you say it. But you want to get some aggregate back in there. And perlite is not a good choice. Perlite, I used it for years. I don't like it. It's eventually going to all float to the top and end up in the floor, and you're just going to lose all of your aggregate. So it's just not a really good choice for you. And then you've got to deal with the biological side, and that's all about quality compost. That's when people are making their own soil, East Coast folks that can't afford shipping, who want to get a nutrient pack from KIS to get balanced mineral nutrients. Their Achilles heel is always trying to find good compost. And when you get a compost, not all composts are created equally. There's a short little checklist. You want to know the pH of that compost just to make sure it's not way out of range. The carbon to nitrogen ratio, obviously, if it's above 18:1, I would find a different compost. The carbon to nitrogen ratio, heavy metals, those are the real blockers. I want to look at sodium. I want to look at the cations as well. But once they have a suitable compost, every couple of rounds you can add that, or alternatively, you can be getting your biology through teas. So there's some options to do that, but every couple of rounds I do like to get some more compost back in there.
Okay, so just to highlight a few things and add a little bit, there's three main things that we're looking at when we're re-amending soil. We want to look at the physical properties of the soil, which is gas exchange, aeration, moisture retention. If you're buying potting soil, that should already be optimized or close enough to optimize, and that's just a matter of maintaining it every cycle. You mentioned the biological properties of the soil. If you're on the West Coast, I'm going to give a shout out to New England Compost. I've seen samples of it and talked to them over there. I think they have a really nice product. So if you're out there, check in with those guys. And if you don't want to bring in compost to add organic matter because of the risk of fungus gnats or other pests, things like that, you could look into making a compost tea or a compost extract as a way of getting beneficial microbes back into the soil. Or you could use a specific microbial inoculant. You have some options there. And then when we talk about the mineral side, which is where we really like to emphasize and target for reamendment, 2 to 3 weeks out. You said 2 weeks. That might be cutting a little close with a few facilities if they're further away and they need to get amendments ordered after seeing the analysis. But if they already have all the amendments on hand and they're doing this all internally, then 2 weeks works great. It's just really important. A couple of things I want to point out with this is it's important to always take the samples the same way and take them correctly. You can do one sample for an entire room if you're treating the room homogenously. And then if you have any outlier beds that just are performing differently for some reason, you could always sample those separately. But you don't need to sample every bed. Bryant, Mason, Soil Doctor, and I have had multiple conversations about this, and the tests always come back close enough. So it saves a lot of money, being able to test per room or per area versus every bed. And then the last thing around the testing, just to mention to folks, we did partner with Logan Labs, and now we are offering the testing directly through KIS for those of you that work with us. And we do an analysis for $35 at the complete soil test. And then if you buy the amendments that we recommend through us, you get a credit towards those amendments. So essentially making the consult portion free. So that is an option for folks that do use us. But anyway, I don't want to focus too much on KIS. I want to keep this podcast, as educational and non sales pitchy as possible.
Right. Brand agnostic.
But I did want to share that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I was just going to say one other thing about soil that gets left out once you look at the mineral, physical, and biological is the IPM side. And so it is really important to keep that soil healthy. We talk about folks that have to flush between rounds because their sodium's too high. It's really important once you've removed those plants, which is a portion of the immune system of the soil, to get something aggressive, whether that's trichoderma or lactobacillus, but some productive biology in there. Because I'm always saying that we've probably got pythium on our faces when we're talking. You're not going to be able to exclude that, but there are some things that you can add into your soil to outcompete it. And then there's the the insect side of things, where you could be putting Bovaria and beneficial insects like SF nematodes or other insects in to prevent fungus gnats, whatever pest pressures you have. And so that's one last piece of that puzzle that I like to just at least start the conversation with folks.
Okay, well, since you brought up flushing, a couple of things I want to mention around that. So we typically don't recommend flushing in organic soils unless you have an excess of nitrates or mineral nutrition in general, or if prior to harvest. Now, after harvest, if you have excessive levels of nitrates, potassium, or more specifically sodium, which we do see when you don't have any runoff potentially build up over time, it's not an essential plant mineral, and it can cause issues and raise your overall soluble salt level. People say flush, but then they have questions about how do I do that? Can you take us through what the flushing process would look like to reduce sodium?
Yeah, that's one that we just see repeatedly with this style of growing. Sodium's highly mobile, but with no runoff, there's no place for it to go. So what we need to do is, if your sodium is creeping up, anytime I see somebody hit 100 ppms, I start talking to them about, let's plan for a flush. But I've seen some pretty scary numbers, 344 parts per million, stuff like that. And so, like you mentioned, the overall soluble salts and related osmotic stress is going to go up exponentially. And then sodium is going to block your productive cations, specifically potassium, and it can actually replace potassium in the plant, which is not good. So we want to flush that. The easiest way to do that, first and foremost, is to make sure that your water is not bringing in extra sodium. So if the contamination is coming from your water, obviously you need to solve that before you do a flush, because pumping more sodium laden water into the bed's not going to fix the problem. But if you have clean water, low sodium, you want to flush approximately 10% by volume. So a 4x4 is typically, with a 12-inch side, 10 inches of soil is almost dead on 100 gallons of soil. And so if you flush that 10%, you want to get 10 gallons of runoff. And most facilities are not set up with this in mind. And so, if you don't have a way to capture your runoff, if you don't have a valve you can open on the bottom of your bed or something like that, you'll have to get a little more creative. I've got, some growers who will catch it in a 5-gallon bucket, and when they've got 2 of those full, they know they've got 10 gallons out. And so, we're growers, we're resourceful, and we'll figure out a way to do it. But you need to get 10% runoff through that bed to essentially cut that sodium or that nitrate in half. And that's typically what we're shooting for. You can bring in an EC meter and, take your EC right when runoff starts, and it'll typically be very high. And then you could continue to flush until that EC is cut in half. And that will give you a more dialed in approach to it. But we have really good success with just the 10%. So that's normally what I do. And then the last little bit, that's where I'll add trichoderma or lactobacillus, just to make sure that I'm getting a really nice biology prophylactic approach to keeping that soil safe.
Yeah, we don't like to do this type of heavy flushing when there's a plant in the bed. This would be after harvest. And just to give people some numbers, so if you have a yard of soil, it's approximately 200 gallons. You're putting 20 gallons of water through it coming out the bottom.
Right.
Okay.
And so it might take 30 or 40 gallons. It just really depends on how dry their soil is. So the runoff target, you want to collect that 10%. And so if you can, so it might take more water than, 10 gallons in a 4x4. It might take 15 or 20 to get 10 gallons to flow out of it, but that's what their target is.
Great. Yeah, you mentioned Bavaria, changing topics here. We're going to bounce around a lot this podcast. And I wanted to talk about some things that we learned about Bavaria last week in a meeting with one of the large major producers of it in North America. And I wanted to just share a little bit of that, but I do hope to do a whole podcast just on Bavaria because I think it's really fascinating. But some of the highlights from that meeting that I want to share was that every species is different and will have slightly different results within that target class of pests that Bavaria works on. So, the particular strain of Bavaria that is sold through Bioworks is going to have different results than the one from Certus, and on and on down the line. So that's not to say that one is better than the other, but that they're just going to have slightly different results across the species that Bavaria works with because they're all different strains and they were all captured naturally from different areas around the world, which also means that they'll have different storage conditions. So some may store in the fridge for 6 months and not have any spore loss, whereas others won't have that same storage life, which I thought was really interesting. I have a couple other things, but did you want to add anything about Bavaria?
Yeah, Bavaria is one of my favorites. I like horticultural oils. I like Bavaria. I thought the conversation was really interesting. Just the whole concept of these biological helpers have been evolving for millennia along with their targets. And so if you get a Bavaria strain from Chile or one from Northern California, they're going to have different efficacies on different insects because they've evolved with different insects. And then just the complexity of, like you just mentioned, storage, what temperatures, there's a different pH range that you want to apply. There's the timing as well. So like with any IPM product for insects, the timing is really important. You want to get that, usually when it's an early molting, stage where you can have better efficacy against the insect. But it's just really important to make sure that you're, in the fly fishing terms, match the hatch. You want to make sure that you've got the right strain for the right target insect and that you are taking all of the environmental factors into account, temperature, pH, those sort of things, the same way you would want to do that if you're deciding between Cucumaris or Swirsky. You want to look at the environment in your greenhouse. And so I was really blown away by how complex these Bavaria strains are and how specific they are. And then I really thought that because we're trying to limit how wet the plant gets, even in veg, the conversation about cold fogging Bavaria was really intriguing to me because that's never occurred to me. And that's something that for a propagation room or a veg room would really free up a lot of labor and get you the coverage you need.
Yeah, one other thing that I have another interview later today with Michael Brownbridge at Bioworks talking about. He's a pathologist and he's going to talk a lot more about Bavaria and these microbes in general. But one of the things that he's discovered through testing that I hope to get him to elaborate on is that some of these brands, and I'm not talking about, the major brands like Bioworks, but some of the people, even in the living soil game, that are selling Bavaria have spore counts so low in their product that you can't even get any sort of efficacy with them. It's just not possible for that to have any actual effect on an insect because of the spore count. So you may be wasting your money as a grower if you're buying some of these products. And this is not unique to the living soil game. There's a lot of companies out there in the ag world too that just have poor quality product in that regard. So don't assume that all Bavaria is going to perform the same or is of the same quality. And then the other thing is that other product labels have actually had claims of spore counts so high that it would not be physiologically possible to fit that many spores into that given volume. So their labels are just completely inaccurate too. So It's an interesting topic when we start thinking about marketing and how it comes into play and what people are claiming around Bavaria. So you just, I guess, buyer beware when it comes to that sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Buyer beware. It's the same thing with mycorrhiza, where you'll see a product that lists, an endo form of mycorrhiza, but the spore count is so low that it's a marketing blurb, but there's no efficacy at all. So you definitely want to do your research and use trusted products.
Yeah, since you brought it up, one of the questions that we get is, is there mycorrhizal fungus in your soil? And the reason we don't add it to our soil mix is because it would strictly be a way of just getting it on the label. It wouldn't actually have any sort of efficacy because it's impossible to get a high enough spore count to make any difference when adding it to your media. You really need to add it specifically to the root zone right at transplant time. If you're going to use it at all. So that's a good point. So when you see it, read the label and then realize that the label might not be accurate um, because of storage conditions, inaccurate product management, and a variety of other reasons. So these microbes get tricky. Um, Moving on, though, since we are talking about microbes, let's talk a little bit about aspergillus because we've had a few people bring that up, bring it to our attention. What can you tell me about aspergillus? We've talked to a few people who have failed for it in their grows. How do we manage it most effectively?
Yeah. So, and this will dovetail into another conversation about root ball removal, and why we like that. But we can come back to that in a second. Um, Fungal pathogens, aspergillus specifically. There's a lot of things. It starts with cultural controls. All of your pathogen control starts with cultural controls. And so you want to make sure that you're moving around your facility always from the head house downstream. You don't ever want to reverse that and go from a flower room back into your veg or your mother room. It's a really good idea to wear some sort of protective clothing, whether that's scrubs or a Tyvek suit or something like that. Just most of the folks that work and grow facilities have a plant or two at home. They're passionate about it, most of them, and so you don't want whatever might be going on there to come to your facility. And so if you seal them into some scrubs or something, hopefully that doesn't get loose in your facility. So that's just one more layer of protection. I really like bleach mats. When you took me to Gold Leaf, I was really happy to see that they had bleach mats at every door. I really like the idea of having a spray bottle with 90% rubbing alcohol in every room, so that as you enter, you can spray yourself down from the forearms and hands. Uh, the other option is to use nitrile gloves, but I don't like to use all that plastic if I don't have to. And then keeping your tools clean, make sure that you've got at least 2 pairs of shears per person so that they can rotate those out into a bleach solution or something between plants. And then it's going to come down to labor constraints. You don't want to stop your workers every 30 seconds. So there'll always be some potential cross contamination. But then the other thing is really controlling your environmental controls. Aspergillus likes a hot, humid room. It really likes to have microclimates, little hot, moist areas. And so defoliation and good fan air movement throughout the room is really good. And then that's a weird catch 22, because if you look at powdery mildew, it needs moist, high humidity to spread, but it also needs dry air to sporulate in the first place. And so you're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. You want high air movement to prevent PM and to prevent aspergillus. But if you've got fusarium, you don't want a lot of CFUs moving through that room, because it's just going to destroy the whole room. And so again, like we were saying with insects or anything, you really have to get a definitive ID on what you're dealing with. And so you want to know, is this aspergillus? Is this some other fungal pathogen? But those are the cultural controls that you can do for that. There are some products, and I know, like you just said, you're going to talk to Michael Brownbridge, Dr. Michael Brownbridge later, and he and I've talked about some products. One of those being trichoderma that you can get into the soil. They also have some other products that could be beneficial for dealing with aspergillus. And then you really want to make sure that you're cleaning your rooms as thoroughly as possible between rounds. And so you could get in there with a good oxidizer and get the floors and the walls at the very least. I see people doing things like running trim machines in a grow room, or they'll harvest and hang their plants in the same grow room, and that's just the opportunity to really inoculate that room. And so you'll see people who pass, and then all of a sudden they fail, and it's just those spore counts are just building up, and then eventually they take over a room, and you'll lose it. And so those are some of the main things you can do. You want a really good air exchange, so you don't want to just be pushing the same room around, or the same air around the facility. You need to get the old air out, the heat and humidity out, and you need to get fresh air in there. I don't know, am I leaving something out? I think that covers it pretty well.
I just want to say Aspergillus is everywhere. It's going to be at differing levels depending on your media and soil, especially if you're using a compost in your soil. We've seen it in a variety of different potting soils from different manufacturers. And it's all about management, like you mentioned. So just something for people to keep in mind. And really, it probably involves a deeper conversation around their specific facility or grow space. But those are some, good basics that everyone should be doing for IPM in any space.
Yeah, and the reports I've seen, the white papers I've read, is that they find aspergillus in every soil, every potting substrate, and so it's just good to know what you're up against, and so you can take the proactive steps and keep your facility clean, get good biology into your soil, and it is everywhere. Exclusion is difficult, and so we want to meet it head on.
Yeah. Okay. I want to switch directions and talk a little bit about heavy metals. There's a few things, we've done podcasts now on heavy metals. You can go back and listen to my one with Bryant Mason, Soul Doctor. There's a few things I want to just bring to highlight for folks, because we are hearing more and more people having to deal with regulations around heavy metals. Do you want to cover? Why don't you go first, Brandon, and just mention a few of the highlights, and then I have a list here of things I want to add to it of what we've learned
Okay.
more recently.
And kind of something I left out on the aspergillus that comes into this same conversation is getting rid of the root ball. We're seeing that heavy metals accumulate, as well as viroids, in the root material, and the recent research has proven that that's where we're getting the heaviest rates of accumulation, whether it's heavy metals or viroids. And so we're heavily recommending that folks remove their root ball so that they can get that out of their soil. And then that just goes back to a comment I meant to make about the aspergillus, is that indoors, folks that leave any sort of detritus, and this includes cover crops and mulch, that's a perfect breeding ground for aspergillus. If you wanted to grow aspergillus, you would leave all your dead leaves on the surface. And so it's really important to keep those beds clean. If you are going to try to do that, you want to make sure that you're incorporating that organic material below the soil surface. And again, I would rather just remove it in an indoor environment. But with heavy metals, again, we want to remove that root ball. There's so many potential contaminants. It could be dust from lead arsenate that's been sitting in your neighbor's field from the 70s. These are persistent. They're not going anywhere. It could be in your water. It could be in your compost. We see that frequently. So there's so many pH up and down products can bring it in. And so it's really important to get a test for anything you want to add to your soil, because you're not going to be able to get those heavy metals out. So you've got to prevent them from getting in there. You can try to control it with a higher pH. We've seen some really interesting things with biochar tying up heavy metals. I've seen some interesting research into silicon being able to outcompete heavy metals for accumulation in the plant. And so there's some things we can try to do to mediate a bad situation, but we really want to prevent it. And that all goes back to testing your products, making sure. And if you contact a producer and ask for a heavy metal test and they blow you off or they won't send it, you can look that up. I believe California has a registry for all the organic products, but you can look them up. But honestly, if they don't send you a heavy metal test, that's a red flag for me, just to keep looking.
Yeah, and I never have a problem if people ask us for additional testing or they want to test the product themselves. I think that's important. But just to highlight some main things again, heavy metals are everywhere. Typically, when water or soil comes in contact with metal, that's a contamination risk for heavy metal uptake. We have seen high levels of certain heavy metals in pH down specific products from pretty big name brands. So do your research there and test. We don't know what levels in soil will cause a plant failure. We can't say that this ppm of arsenic in soil is going to cause, or in your media is going to cause this level of ppm in your plant, because there's so many variables between your VPD, how are you watering, what your PPFD is on, light intensity on that plant. What sort of biological activity and nutrient cycling do you have happening? What is your pH? All of these things are going to affect uptake. What is the genetics that you're running? That's a huge one. Different cultivars are going to be more efficient at pulling up heavy metals than others. And honestly, if you need to pull heavy metals out of your soil, unfortunately, hemp and cannabis are probably the best plant for that too. So it is a challenge. So the key for us, what we try to do at KIS at least, is we try to start at a level that we know we're going to pass regulation below whatever that regulatory threshold is. And then we know that we have a removal rate, because we know there's going to be some heavy metals in our soils. We just need to keep them low. We need to manage them. And then when you go to harvest your crop, you're going to be pulling out small amounts of heavy metals. What we have to do is make sure that that level is going to allow you to pass. And then the next round, when we re-amend, we're re-amending with less than you pulled out. So we're always moving in the direction of removing heavy metals. And interestingly enough, we did a test with gold leaf soil. I think it was a couple of years ago now. So they're probably 6 years into that soil. We actually tested it in the Michigan market, sent a sample over there, and it passed undetected for heavy metals, which was awesome. And so I know that it's possible with this method to grow and pass, but you do have to be diligent. And where we see people get in trouble is when they start adding other products, and maybe they haven't tested all the products and they just assume from the manufacturer that it's safe. And that's where we start to see people fail. And the more products you add, the more variables you have to go back and test, which can get very expensive down the road. And that can be teas, that can be microbials, that can be just about anything. Like we said, pH down. So you really do have to do your research there. And that doesn't even get into, I just saw a webinar the other day by Patricia Atkins. I might have to get her on the podcast. She's with Antilia Scientific. And what she was talking about with heavy metals is the laboratory side, and how many fail points there are in the laboratory, from the type of water that they're using to how clean the facility is, to if they have metal furniture in that space, to the gloves that they're choosing to use actually have heavy metals on the gloves and levels of zinc and other things. So it's challenging.
Yeah, and when you're looking at when you're looking at levels that low, the margin of error, that small 0.02 parts per billion or something like that, the margin of error as the unit gets smaller, the margin for error exponentially gets bigger and bigger. And so, with heavy metals, it's really difficult. It's just really difficult. So you want to manage everything up front by exclusion and test and everything. And then another thing is RO water, and we can talk about RO water because I get a lot of calls about that. But RO water is hungry water. There's no ions in it. And so anything it passes over, it's going to grab ions from. So if it's going through, cheap plastic, if it's going through a brass spigot, if it's going, any metal, plastic, anything that water's passing through or over could very well grab heavy metals and deposit those into your bed. So that's another thing. You want to make sure that water's buffered before you get it back into your beds or pots.
Yeah, absolutely. I had something else on heavy metals, but I'm blanking on it at the moment. So I'll have to come back to it. Oh, I just remembered. So the other thing with heavy metals too is they appear to accumulate more in older tissue. So if you can send in I think a younger part of the plant as well as less stem in that plant, that is probably going to test lower. I'd like to see more research around that, but that's just sort of the direction I would head based off of what we've been learning about heavy metals. So want to pass that along. So moving on to a new topic, I know you get asked a lot, like what's the secret sauce? What's that special product that's going to make your grow, I guess, special? What do you have to say about that?
Man, after 38, I'll have 38 years of cannabis under my belt in May. And I've done, hydro for 18 years, organics for 20 years. I've tried every kind of setup that you can imagine. And the KIS system, and again, I don't want this to be a KIS ad, but just a simple organic living soil with testing and amendments with safe products is the easiest workflow I've ever had. And so after trying, the Frankenstein approach, just every product you can imagine, the most simple SOP has given me the best yields and the best quality cannabis. And so it all comes down to managing your environment, making sure that you have adequate nutrients available to your plant. And the secret sauce is time and patience and paying attention to your plants, listening to your plants, observing your plants, taking data, getting in there, doing scoping, defoliating, looking for pests and pathogens. That's really the secret sauce, is the folks that spend more time in their garden have better grows. Because I could give, 10 different growers all the exact same inputs, cultivars, whatever, and they're going to have dramatically different results. And a lot of folks, and it's not their fault. A lot of growers are burned out. It can be monotonous. It can be, it's a lot of hours. I know that for a fact. You can easily burn a 80-hour work week on a farm. And so a lot of growers get burned out, and they come in, they check, make sure everything's watered, and they just want to get out of there. And I don't fault them for that. But the thing that you need to do is spend more time. And so if you can automate your watering, so you're not doing that by hand, and get more time, that's a dunk just for the return on investment side of things. But anything you can do so that you can free up your grower, especially your higher end grower, so they're not on, holding a hose or something like that, that's what's going to get you better results. And then the next thing would be, if you want to try a special, secret sauce, if you want to try a product, you need to start off with, like we always tell people to start off with just water only for their first round. And they're like, well, but if we add this or we add that, well, if you add anything, you do not have a base data set, and you really, really need to get a base data set so you can make decisions moving forward. So if there is a product that your buddy's using or you read about or saw on a podcast and you really want to use it, you need to set up a control. So that's the only thing you're adding. And then you have other beds or pots with the exact same PPFD, CO2, all the environment is the same. And then you can determine at the end of that round, did I get a statistically relevant bump on my return for the money I spent? Because, if you're if you just got a 4x4 tent, you can go crazy because you just really can't spend too much money. And so I think that that's a lot of fun to play around with different products and that kind of stuff. But on scale, you really have to take a scientific approach to it, because you just can't afford to spend or waste, I should say, that kind of capital. And then there's a lot of products out there that, are marketed to growers that don't really produce, and look to traditional ag as well. That's one of my mantras. I'm always begging people to, cannabis is very special to me. It's very special to me, to my family. It's not special in agriculture, and there's no corn or soybean guys spending $6,000 on aloe water or, some of these products that, there's a place and time in a small operation where that might work. But for growers on scale, you need to be spending time with your plants. You really have to check in daily. And that would be my soapbox on all that.
Yeah, I have a couple thoughts on this too. So one, I agree that there's a lot of, I see it marketing all the time on Instagram, and even stuff like that's pushed forward as education around how to grow, but it's really just product based. They're just pushing products on you, and it frankly drives me a little crazy, and I don't know how to combat that. Um, and at the end of the day, it's a lot of hype around product. And if you think about it, or at least how I approach it is, like you said, you want to control for a variable, test one thing at a time, get a baseline, but add something. And if you do get a result, try and think about why you got that result. It means you had some sort of limiting factor of growth that product addressed, whether it was nitrogen, whether it was nutrient cycling through microbes, whether it was, whatever macronutrient. At the end of the day, that's what you want to consider when you're thinking about product from a non-marketing perspective. And then the other thing about this, and I really love this about Nate over at Goldleaf. So for him, his secret sauce is his soil, because he got soil over 8 years ago now. And that soil has been in his facility. He's been managing it in a very specific microclimate that's unique to him. And so the expression that he's going to get from his genetics is going to be totally different because of that microbial succession and co-evolution between his cannabis plant and his soil that's been happening over the last 8 years, cycle after cycle. That's what, probably 40 plus cycles now in that soil. And so for him, his secret sauce is his soil. That's his that's his special sauce, because it allows him to have, unique terpene expression, different unique cannabinoid levels. And so I think that's kind of a better way to approach the secret sauce idea, is just realize that as a grower, that soil that you're managing, if you are reusing it, is going to become unique to you. It's not, it's no longer a name brand soil. It's now your ecology habitat that you created. And so that can be special and can be a marketing tool down the road for growers, depending on your market. So.
And I think that's super important, and I couldn't agree more. When Allison Schaefer just got interviewed for their local paper, that's Justin McGill's lead grower for the high end Mako Farms, and she said the exact same thing. She said either their secret recipe or their secret weapon is their soil. And it just goes back to the same thing. They've been running KIS soil for a number of years. You start to, obviously there's no humic fraction in a potting substrate, but you do start to approach something similar to where you've got nutrients just flowing into solution. And then you've got the microbiology that's going to be completely unique to your environment and your grow. And whether that's driving trichome production or driving a different terpene profile, that is what's going to set you aside. And so some of the things we were talking about earlier, as far as like how you manage your soil, keep it healthy, that's going to have everything to do with your final product. And so again, you could give 4 different growers the same cultivar, and put it in their soil, and one's going to definitely come out on top. One of them's going to have, a better expression just because of that soil.
Yeah, and I want to change topics again here and talk a little bit about no-till. You and I are going to agree on this because we've talked about it multiple times, but I want to kind of share some thoughts around it. And I met Steve Cantwell, Green Life Productions, down in Vegas, face to face for the first time last month, I think it was, at the Living Soil Summit where we were both speaking, and I got to hear him speak. And I got to say, I have a ton of, I already had a ton of respect for the guy, but I love what he's doing. I love his thought process, and the innovation that he brings to the community is amazing. Now, Steve's a cover crop guy. Steve's a no-till guy. Steve's came up with the idea of bottomless pots, which I think is potentially very brilliant. I can't wait to do some trials with it. So I share this twofold. One, because I'm going to give you my reasoning for why I don't do those things in the facilities that we work with, or I don't recommend them. Some of them still do it, and that's fine. But also that we're all a community here, and at the end of the day, like, it's this innovation that pushes us forward. And when we become dogmatic in the way that we grow, we aren't open to what other people are doing or what other people are sharing, I think it really limits us. And people try and act like we're we're against each other on this sort of thing. And while we have differing opinions, Steve and I get along great. So I just want to throw that out there. There's no drama there. But I do want to talk about why we don't recommend cover crops indoors, and why I don't really like the term no-till indoors as well. So, and this is a complicated topic. Cover crops, potentially, one, they're another crop you have to manage. 2, they are habit and ecology for pests and pathogens, potentially. And 3, and the biggest reason for me, even though those 2 are huge, is that I want to mix my nutrients back into my soil, down into the rhizosphere. I don't want to top dress it because of our short flowering cycle. I want those nutrients available immediately. And having cover crops in there makes it impossible, or much more challenging, for me to do that. And we have this term no-till, which, when we amend indoor beds, we're not truly tilling anyway. We're not running a tiller. We're shoveling it, which does not have the same impacts on biology that a tiller would. And we're not creating a compaction zone like you would with a tiller if we're using a shovel. So the other advantages of this, just to highlight, are you're removing the roots, which would potentially lower your heavy metal content in that soil for the next cycle. You're getting your nutrients directly into the rhizosphere. And there's this disturbance hypothesis that Dr. Ben Higgins talks about, that I might need to do an episode with him on this. But essentially, the idea is that we have ecological systems, starting with our primary systems, which would be like right after a volcano erupts and you just have rock, right? You have bare rock, and then slowly life starts to come in. Those are our beginning successional systems, all the way through, then you have grasslands, temperate forests, all the way through to our old growth forests, like the redwoods. That would be considered an apex or climax ecosystem. Where we have the most biodiversity, and in theory, where cannabis would most like to grow, is really in the middle there. It's not in these apex, no-till climax ecosystems. It's where we have the most biodiversity is through disturbance. And that disturbance allows us to sort of maintain a little bit more ecological diversity and biodiversity. In theory, I don't know how anyone would ever prove or disprove what I'm saying, just because we don't have the technology to truly measure these things, because of how rapidly these microbial communities are changing. But I do feel like that's really our sweet spot and why we see the results that we do. Is there anything you want to add around no-till or cover crops?
Yeah, no, I'm on the exact same page. I am a no-till person, but no-till doesn't mean no-till, because like I always say, I always bring up phosphorus. It's only going to move, phosphate's going to move a half an inch in your profile on its own. So if you're not, scratching in 3 or 4 inches down to where your roots can get to it, your plants are going to be super slow. Top dress is a super slow release. The biology can't get to it and make it available in an ionic form for your plant. And then you're potentially creating an impermeable layer on top that would love to grow fungal, spores of some sort, some good, some bad. And then I love what you were just saying about Ben. We're not trying to mimic nature. We're trying to do better. There's lots of loss in nature, and we're trying to prevent that. But yeah, so I think that you nailed all that.
Yeah, this idea of doing what nature does is, I think, a little bit of a fallacy, because nature doesn't have weeds. Nature doesn't select for one crop species over another to the exclusion of others. And you don't see the level of health in nature typically that you would, especially across a vast quantity of plants, which is what we're
Well,
trying to do when we grow cannabis.
and you don't see monocrops in nature. You're not just going to walk out into an old growth forest and see a field of, homogeneous cannabis anywhere, and so that's, we're doing something different. I shouldn't say better. We're just doing something different. And so, some of the natural processes are not beneficial to us in a controlled environment.
Yeah, and I do love cover crops, mulches, those sorts of things outdoors. So I want to, or even in greenhouse environments. So I want to make that clear. But the other thing too is just that while we don't see monocrops in nature, we we do see. I guess what I want to add to this is we do see healthy plants in nature, and the biodiversity is important. But adding, you know, a 5 or 7 crop cover crop is not really increasing our biodiversity anywhere near the levels that we would see naturally. So to me, that's still monocropping pretty much.
Yeah, and it just makes me so nervous to add a cover crop indoor. What's the advantage? So it helps with your moisture retention. I'd much rather set up a blue mat system and automate my water, so I'm not having to worry about that. It can prevent erosion. And I always joke that if you've got erosion indoors, you should try an instrument that maybe growing's not the thing you should be doing, because, how are you, creating erosion indoors? So that shouldn't be a factor. And then it makes, we're already adding in the nutrients based on, very tested targets. So we don't need, any nitrogen fixing in our beds. And then it makes it so next to impossible to till in your nutrients. You're going to have to tear up all that organic matter and work it under the soil. And it goes back to the aspergillus conversation. If you've got cover crop and, you get a pest or a pathogen in there, you're going to have hell to pay on that. It's going to be really tough.
And Steve talks about how he's growing in a desert in Nevada, and so his pest pressure is very different than what a lot of us face in other parts of the country. He doesn't have a lot of crops being grown around him, from what I understand, and he is downright militant about who gets into his facility and who gets into his flowering rooms. He said in his talk that there's a lot of people that work in his facilities that have never seen his flowering spaces because they don't need to. And that's the sort of IPM that allows you to do the things that he's doing, I think, because he's really doing a great job of keeping pests out away from his plants and out of his facility. You're not allowed to grow if you work for him. You're not allowed to do a lot of those things that lead to problems. So yeah, a lot of respect for Steve.
Yeah, and I
Slightly
love
different
this.
opinion on on cover
Yeah,
crops.
yeah, and I love that you're always open to conversation and even being wrong. And yeah, I love to keep the conversations and keeping our minds open, and that's how we learn and how we get better. And like, that's one of my favorite things about cultivation is I learn something every single day. I was joking with somebody the other day. I was like, sometimes I learned that I was wrong, and that's exciting. It's everybody's got an ego, some level of it, and so it's humbling to be wrong. But man, it's exciting because you get to go off on a whole other area of learning. And so I'm very grateful for the folks who have differing opinions, but the folks that bring it to the table respectfully and in a genuine, sincere desire to learn more and to help other growers. So I love that. That's part of the conversation, just keeping everybody's minds open. And we're all on the same team. We all want to push the needle towards sustainable. And we all, every path of the organic, sustainable movement has stuff to contribute.
So one other question I get all the time, especially since I started doing the plant trivia posts on Instagram, was diagnosis. So people send plant photos of some issue or another they're dealing with their plant. How do you approach diagnosing a plant?
That's yeah. So diagnosis in person is difficult, and so for me to diagnose, from across the country over the phone is really difficult. But we do have a systematic approach to that, and we've got the dichotomous key on the website that folks can look at that will give them a really good fighting chance at figuring out what's going on. The first thing you really need to do is determine if it's a nutrient issue. And so one of the easiest ways to do that, one of the tried and true ways, is to look at your individual ranges. And any range would be, whether it's a bed or a group of pots. But when I say range, I just mean a uniform cultivar and feed schedule, and then uniform environmentals. And if you look at that, and that whole bed is showing some symptom, it's all yellowing or something, then if the entire bed is affected, you can usually safely assume that it's nutrient. Now, it might be a nutrient issue because the whole bed got overwatered and there's been root death. And so it's showing nitrogen issues. But if you can see a consistent across the entire range issue, then you're pretty safe to assume you need to go down the nutrient path. Pests and pathogens tend to jump around, and so you'll have one plant tanking and then a plant right beside it that's doing fine. That's time to get out the scope, look at roots, maybe do some testing. But if you see something uniform, you want to inspect the range and you want to look at the plants, and what the first thing you want to notice is, where is the problem starting? Don't even worry about what the issue is. Where is it starting on the plant? If it's starting on the bottom of the plant, then it's a mobile element. And so what's happening is the apical growing tip, the plant is trying to reproduce itself. It's just doing what biology does. It's trying to make progeny. And so it's going to sacrifice those lower leaves and flowers to the top of the plant to make sure that that's healthy and can receive pollen and make seeds for the next round. And that's what the plant wants to do to preserve itself. And so if you're losing nutrients at the bottom, it's a mobile element. And so you can, kind of break that down pretty quickly. It's either nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, or magnesium. And that's pretty easy. Magnesium is probably the easiest one to diagnose. It's just that interveinal chlorosis. Potassium is chlorosis, that stays on the margin and then rapidly goes to necrosis. phosphorus, the whole plant will get dark, but the bottoms, the tips will start to burn, and the leaf will go necrotic. Nitrogen, the whole leaf goes yellow, goes chlorotic, and then you'll have leaf abscission where the leaf will just pop off before it goes necrotic. You can just pop it right off, or it'll fall off. And so then if it's not at the bottom, then you know that it's a immobile element. And that's where I see most of the misdiagnoses. A lot of folks will see burning at the top and assume that it's they've got too much nitrogen, when in fact that's almost always a calcium deficiency. There's a couple that will show across the entire plant, like sulfur. The entire plant will go kind of light green. And then there's things that happen at the top of the plant, like iron, consistently in every grow I've ever seen. The very top of the plant is a little bit of lime green, especially where the petiole end of the leaf, and that's iron, and it just grows out, repeatedly over and over again. And so just using a dichotomous key to see where on the plant it's starting will limit what nutrients you're going to look at. And then there's very specific symptoms that come with that. And so you could get out the nutrient deficiencies in bedding plants. That book is a great book, because you could go around your yard and look at every single plant, and because that dichotomous key is not specific to cannabis. It's designed for cannabis with cannabis illustrations to help growers, but you can apply that to grasses, to flowering plants. And so it's practice. That's the thing, is you can't just get that overnight. You're going to have to practice. And so you're going to have to look at that dichotomous key, and you're going to have to run through your plants and, practice on what's in your garden that's not cannabis. Practice, if you go to a friend's house, look at their plants. Don't drive them crazy with diagnosis, but, just the more times you can repeat that process, where, is it nutrient? Is it a consistent symptom throughout the range? Where on the plant did it start? And then based on where on the plant it started, start looking at the individual symptoms. And then it's pretty straightforward to dial that in. I guess the only other thing is just to don't neglect environmental changes. Or differences. If you've got a big greenhouse and everything's planted the same, you might have a corner that's shady, and so it's accidentally getting overwatered. It's just not getting the same growth rate, that sort of thing. I think everybody's first initial instinct is it's nutrients, and it might be nutrients, but it might be some environmental factor that's preventing it from getting into the plant as well, like calcium. If your VPD's off, doesn't matter how much calcium you've got in the soil, it's just not going to get into the plant.
Yeah, I think you covered it. I don't really have a lot to add there, other than when people send me their photos, I try to give a diagnosis, but it's always a challenge. So just keep that in mind. I'll do my best, but yeah, like you said, it's impossible to tell just from a photo.
And if they can give you that information, because a lot of times people will send me a picture of a leaf and they're like, what's going on with the plant? And if you could send me a picture of the leaf, send me a picture of the entire plant, like backed away from it, and then some information as to, when it started, where did it start? Is it homogeneous throughout the range? Is it only one cultivar? Justin McGill has one of the most amazing grow facilities I've ever seen. It's like the surgery room. The floors are polished, and it's the cleanest place. The nutrients are dialed in. They've got one, I think it's their white star dog. It always presents some deficiency at the end of the round. And so as long as you are okay with that, then the nutrients across the board, there's always going to be certain outlier cultivars that are super heavy feeders, super light feeders. And so that could be an issue as well. So always consider the cultivar and the environment as well.
Yeah, Justin's facility is great in the sense of the staff and how they They care for the plants, keep things clean. It does have just if people go online and look at the pictures on Instagram, he does have old life. He does have old tech in there, but they still grow consistently really good plants because of all the other reasons that you listed. So I just want to throw that out there, just in case people do go look that up and check him out, which they should. He's a great grower, and they're definitely a facility to follow along if you're interested in this style of growing. Okay, last topic in under 5 minutes because we're almost out of time. You said you get asked a lot about white ash. Do you want to go ahead and touch on that, and then we'll sign off on the podcast for today?
Yeah, I'll make this really quick. Bottom line for white ash is it should not be a driver for why you're selecting your cannabis. There's all kinds of myths that it's heavy metals, it's pesticides, it's not flushed properly for hydro grows. There's been a ton of research. You can go on the forums and get led down all kinds of primrose pathways, but if you go back, like I said earlier, go to traditional ag and look at the research before you spend money on something. With white ash, there's tons of research. It's been done. We don't need to do it again. You could look at the tobacco industry. They're kind of responsible for the whole white ash mythology. But also forestry services, both here and in Europe, fire departments, they study combustion science. That's not new. There's 200 years of research that we can look at. And ash color has nothing to do with pesticides, has nothing to do with heavy metals, has nothing to do with mineral content. Ash color is determined by carbon, and whether all the organic matter, all the carbon-based material has been burned off and converted to carbon dioxide, and it's left the building. It's gone now. And if all the carbon is left the building, then you end up with a perfectly white ash. And the only thing that's left behind are the mineral constituents, a lot of sodium, magnesium. But, so when people say it wasn't flushed and that's why it had too much nitrate or something like that in the plant, that's not why it's burning salt and pepper or dark. Because in perfect white ash, the only thing that's left behind is the mineral content. There's a chemist who did a bunch of experiments on it, but it all comes down to moisture content. You could have the best herb in the world that's not perfectly dry and burn it, and you're going to get a dark ash. And then you could have heavy metal, pesticide laden, horrible, swaggy brickweed, and it'll burn perfectly white if it's super dry, because all the carbon's been burned off. So at the end of the day, I just don't want people to, that's a myth that if we don't get it out of cannabis, how do they get cigarettes to burn perfectly white? Well, they spray products on that. And I don't want tobacco ethics or sprays in my cannabis experience. I don't want anything to do with that. And so my incentive for trying to stomp on this one particular myth is because if we don't stomp on this one, eventually we will have cannabis producers, spraying their final product with additives so that it will burn white if that is a driver. Like THC, is a huge driver. If you go into a dispensary, that's what they're going to tell you. This is a THC level on this, and this. But we know from blind tests that people are picking their cannabis based off of the terpene profile more than the THC. And so when it comes to drivers on why you're paying what you're paying and what the experience is, if aesthetically it does something special for you to have white ash in your pipe or on your joint, then cool, go for it. But as far as the science behind it and studying combustion science, there's no validity to the white ash myth at all, just zero. It all comes down to temperature, and you can go ask a fireman. Probably the average fireman could do a much better job of explaining this, or somebody in the forestry department. But the things that would prevent one finished flower from being white versus another one would be the moisture content and the resin content. And then a really interesting side note on this is that THC to CBD ratios may have something to do with it, because the way that the THC molecule, it's a 2-dimensional molecule. It lays flat. CBD is a 3-dimensional molecule. And so when you decarboxylate that, you have the protonation of a carbon group. It has to leave, but then there's a proton has to come in for that to happen. With CBD, because it's 3-dimensional, that second ring is blocking that proton, and so it slows the decarboxylation. And so could that be another part of the puzzle as to why, those ratios? It certainly could, but bottom line, end of the day, is white ash has nothing to do with the quality of the finished product.
Okay, I don't have anything to add on that topic, as you know, but I appreciate you sharing that for folks, and thanks for taking the time today to do this.
No, thanks. I enjoy it. Always fun.
That was Brandon Hudson, and you are listening to the Cannabis Cultivation and Science podcast. I'm your host, Tad Hussey. If you like the podcast, please leave us a rating and review and give us a follow on Instagram. You can also sign up for our newsletter on our website homepage to stay up to date on the latest research and information. Thanks for listening.